My name is Marcos Fernandez, and this is an experience I lived through. Today I want to share something that happened to me about 25 years ago when I was around 18. My father had built a small house on my grandparents' property in a small village near the port of Veracruz. The house had only 2 rooms. One served as the living room, kitchen and dining area, while the other was a shared bedroom. It was a very modest home, but it was enough for my parents and me. When I turned 6, we moved to a larger house because my mother was expecting another child. The first house we lived in was then occupied by a woman in her 60s named Rosa, who lived with her mother, Doña Veneranda, who was over 90 years old. Doña Veneranda was blind and could barely take care of herself. Rosa, a spinster, was skilled in embroidery, weaving and traditional healing. She performed spiritual cleansings, prescribed herbal remedies, and could even tell if someone had cast a spell on you and how to undo it. My father and I would often visit my grandmother after work and school, and naturally we became friends with Rosa and Doña Veneranda, who were now living in our old home. I vividly remember the first time I saw Rosa's altar. It was in the far left corner of the main room, set on a small cabinet with a white crocheted cloth. It had candles, crucifixes, a white basin always filled with water, rosaries, spiritual candles, images of saints, flowers, and healing basil. It was striking to see something like that in the house where I had once lived. When Rosa wasn't performing cleansings, she would sit Doña Veneranda in a chair near the altar, and they would spend their afternoons together. Rosa would embroider while they listened to the radio or watched TV. Although my grandmother was bothered by the number of people who came to Rosa for spiritual help, the 2 women became good friends and kept each other company. They often prayed the rosary together and enjoyed watching Brazilian soap operas, which they loved. When Doña Veneranda passed away, Rosa moved away. By then, I was 18 and had returned to the small house to keep my grandmother company, as she was mostly alone during the day, except for one of my uncles, who was often away at work. One morning, while having breakfast alone, I noticed that the glass of water I had poured was almost empty. I was sure I had filled it, but it was nearly gone. I didn't think much of it at first and poured more water, but it kept happening. I started paying closer attention, placing objects like a salt shaker or an apple next to the glass to measure the water level. Every time, the water would decrease without me drinking it. I began to think I was going crazy. When I told my parents, they dismissed it as my imagination and called me crazy. I tried to ignore it, but it kept happening. I would fill the glass and within minutes the water level would drop. It wasn't evaporation. It was as if someone was drinking it. One day, while talking to my family, I mentioned the strange occurrence. An aunt who often visited me said, "Your table is exactly where Rosa used to sit with Doña Veneranda. That's where her altar was, where she performed her cleansings. There were always spiritual candles, herbs and white flowers. She suggested I move the table. I did so without issue as I lived alone and had few belongings. In the corner where the table had been, I placed a small shelf with an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe and a candle that I lit occasionally. After that, the water stopped disappearing. I could eat my meals without the water level changing. Over time, I almost convinced myself it had all been in my head, but to this day, I still glance suspiciously at my water glass while eating. Time passed and my grandmother fell ill, remaining bedridden for months. Rosa would visit her occasionally. One day, Rosa told us, "When Doña Tomasa passes away, let me know immediately." My grandmother died around 5 a.m. on a cool, rainy morning. After making the initial arrangements, my father asked me to go tell Rosa. I walked for about 2 minutes to her house, located in a rural area with a garden full of plants. It was around 7 a.m. and a light drizzle was falling. I noticed the gate was unlocked, which was unusual because Rosa always kept it locked. I pushed it open and entered. The front door was slightly ajar, so I knocked and said good morning as I walked in, something I did out of familiarity. Rosa greeted me from inside. "Good morning, come in, Jose." I entered the dining room where Rosa was sitting at the table dressed in black. I sat beside her, trying to figure out how to tell her about my grandmother's passing, but before I could speak, she said, "Tomasa has died. She has gone to her father's house." I was stunned and confirmed it was true. I asked who had told her, and she replied, "Veneranda." She woke me around 5 a.m., tapping on the headboard of my bed, saying, "Get up, Rosa, we must go accompany her. That's why I'm ready. I'll go with Mama as soon as I finish my coffee." A chill ran down my spine as I heard this. I managed to say, "Well, I'll be going, Doña Rosa. I have other errands to run and need to inform more people." She replied that she would see us later. When I got home, I told my parents and uncles what had happened, but they dismissed it, saying Rosa must have been joking. My mother even laughed, saying Rosa had probably seen me coming and guessed why I was there. But I wasn't convinced. The timing of Rosa's story matched the exact time of my grandmother's death, and the way she spoke, dressed in black, left a deep impression on me. Rosa arrived at my grandmother's house shortly after I did. After offering her condolences, she joined my parents and uncles in the room where my grandmother's body lay. They prayed the first rosary with her body present. Around 11 a.m., the funeral home staff arrived. Since the town was small, they were familiar with our family. They asked everyone to leave the room while they prepared the body. At one point, one of the workers told my cousin and me, "You need to take the little old lady out of the room. The formaldehyde will harm her." My cousin replied, "What old lady? Everyone has already left. There's no one in there." He insisted, "Of course there is. There's a woman sitting in the corner by the window." Just then, his colleague, who had just left the room, called out to him, saying there was no one there and they needed to start working. I was visibly shaken, but my cousin brushed it off and asked me to help with other tasks. Later that day, one of my aunts brought her elderly dog to the house. Since it was still raining, they brought the dog inside to keep it dry. Throughout the day, people came and went, and by evening, friends began arriving for the wake. At one point, my uncle, who wasn't fond of animals, approached the dog's owner and said, "Your dog is acting strange. I've come in here twice, and it just sits in the corner, staring at the wall, wagging its tail and moving its ears." He was referring to the corner where Rosa's altar had once been. My aunt tried to call the dog to another room, but it reacted almost aggressively, so she left it where it was. Around 8 p.m., Rosa asked someone to take her home so she could bathe and change clothes. A neighbor offered to drive her. When he returned, he told us something strange had happened. He said that at one point during the drive, he felt like there was someone else in the back seat. He kept checking the rearview mirror but saw nothing. Rosa's presence reassured him, so he continued talking to her. After dropping her off and waiting for about half an hour, he felt the presence again when she returned to the car. It wasn't until they arrived back at my grandmother's house that the feeling disappeared. A neighbor suggested he was just nervous because of the rain and the somber mood, but the incident left him unsettled. The wake proceeded without further issues, if you can call it that. The next day, as we carried my grandmother's coffin to the cemetery, it was still drizzling. My cousin Carmen remarked, "Grandma didn't like going out, and it seems the sky is respecting her wishes." That night, the funeral staff came to collect their equipment. The same worker who had mentioned the little old lady earlier told us, "I was talking to Doña Rosa at the cemetery entrance, and I mentioned how I got scared yesterday because the woman in the room looked so much like my Aunt Benedita." Rosa said, "Maybe it was her, but my aunt has been dead for years. Rosa thinks she can fool me like we're still kids." Everyone laughed, but I was deeply unsettled. Later, during the novena prayers held over 9 days, my mother shared something unusual. She said a relative had noticed 2 elderly women in a photograph and commented, "These ladies were at the funeral, but now that I see the photo, they look much older. At the cemetery, they were standing very straight." My mother replied that she had only seen Rosa and didn't notice anyone else. The relative insisted. They were dressed entirely in black, even their stockings. In the photo, it was Rosa and Doña Veneranda, who had attended a cousin's first communion. My mother later told us, "Maybe it's true. Maybe Veneranda came to accompany Tomasa." In the 3rd month after my grandmother's death, something strange happened during the novena. The house was filled with a strong scent of basil and incense, like what's used in churches. The smell was most intense in my house, but disappeared suddenly during the novena. After that, nothing unusual happened again. To this day, I'm convinced that Doña Veneranda's spirit was with us during my grandmother's wake and burial. These events, no matter how small, have left a lasting impression on my family and me. We still talk about them during our gatherings. My son George has always had the strangest friends. I don't know why, but from his earliest years, he seemed to attract what you might call the quirky kids. I have plenty of stories about this, but one in particular stands out like a thorn. It happened when he was in 4th grade. We had just moved due to my husband's job transfer, so George was the new kid at school. He's always been outgoing and friendly, so my husband and I weren't too worried about him making new friends. The family was adjusting well, and George seemed to be doing fine at school. I was relieved when I met the parents of his classmates. They all seemed like decent, respectable people. A few months after the move, I got a call from George's school in the middle of the day. They asked one of us to come in to discuss an incident involving George and another student. My husband was at work, so I went. After checking in at the office, I was told it was a minor issue, but I was confused because it was completely out of character for George, which made it even more concerning. As I walked him to the principal's office, he refused to answer any of my questions about what had happened. This was unusual for him. He's usually very talkative and loves to share every detail. His silence was unsettling. I figured he might be embarrassed or scared, so I didn't push too hard. The principal asked George to wait in the hallway while we talked. After closing the door, he gestured for me to sit and began asking questions about George's behavior at home, whether he was obedient, respectful, and so on. I had nothing but positive things to say. George was a well-behaved, respectful kid, and this wasn't just me being a biased mom. It was the truth. Eventually, the principal explained why I'd been called. Apparently, George had gotten into a brief altercation with another student after recess. The boy's name was Sebastian. I asked for details, and here's what I was told. George and Sebastian were the last kids outside and were walking up the stairs together when, out of nowhere, George took an eraser from his pocket and hit Sebastian on the head, causing him to fall and start screaming. I was stunned. This was completely unlike George. He would never do something like that without a reason. Plus, I'd heard about Sebastian before. George had spoken fondly of him, as if they were good friends. I pressed the principal for more information, but he didn't have answers. No one had witnessed the incident, though both boys had independently confirmed the details. The principal assured me George wasn't in trouble, as minor scuffles weren't uncommon. He just wanted to inform me and no further action would be taken. That put me at ease, but I was still puzzled. Later that evening, George finally opened up to me before bed. I'll admit, I was frustrated with him for staying silent earlier, and maybe that's why he decided to talk. He told me Sebastian had tricked him. I asked him to explain, and he said they were playing a game where they followed Sebastian's instructions. George took out an eraser to perform a special move or something like that, and out of nowhere, Sebastian fell to the ground and pretended to be seriously hurt. Then, Sebastian whispered to George that he'd break his arm for real if George didn't pretend he had attacked him. So George went along with it, and the teachers assumed it was a real fight. I was furious. My son had been manipulated and falsely accused. Instead of going back to the school, I decided to handle it myself. That night I looked up Sebastian's mom's number in the school directory. Her name was Maggie, and I was surprised by how sweet and sincere she sounded on the phone. She told me she already knew about the incident. Sebastian had confessed the truth to her, and she had reprimanded him. I found it odd that Sebastian had come clean so quickly, but I was relieved I didn't have to convince her. She explained that Sebastian had always had some behavioral issues growing up, and sometimes acted like he was someone else. As she spoke, I started to feel sorry for him. It sounded like he didn't have full control over some of his actions. Maggie suggested the boys have a movie night to move past the incident and become real friends, which I thought was a great idea. She offered to host, and I agreed. That weekend, I took George to her house. He was back to his usual cheerful, talkative self. Maggie invited me in, and we got to know each other over a glass of wine while the boys played in the basement. As I mentioned earlier, Maggie seemed like a completely honest and respectable person, and I genuinely enjoyed her company. I ended up staying for a few hours and the time flew by. Eventually, I brought up Sebastian's behavior, as it had been bothering me. Maggie's demeanor changed completely, and her voice grew quiet. She told me Sebastian had always struggled to make friends, and had seen several doctors. They believed it was something he'd grow out of, and she said he'd improved a lot in controlling himself. The fact that he was being more social at school was a good sign, she added. I didn't press further. I just wanted to make sure George would be safe that night. Maggie assured me he was in good hands and that Sebastian had no history of violence, just odd behavior. That was enough for me, and honestly, it was somewhat comforting to know George was helping Sebastian build friendships. When it was time to leave, I went to the basement to say goodbye to George. The boys were laughing and playing Battleship, and they seemed to be getting along really well. I kissed George goodbye and headed home. The next morning, I went to pick him up. He was waiting by the door with all his things and a big smile on his face. I assumed the night had gone well. I greeted Maggie, loaded George's stuff into the car, and we left. But on the drive home, George suddenly started crying. I asked him what was wrong, and what he told me was jaw-dropping. He said everything had been fine until bedtime. The boys had set up their sleeping bags in the basement, with 2 mattresses side by side. Everything seemed normal when they went to sleep, but at some point during the night, George woke up. At first, he didn't know why, but then he heard whispers. The sound was coming from the bathroom. The door was slightly open, and there was a strange flickering light inside. Not like a normal bathroom light, George said, but more like candlelight. He listened closer and realized it was Sebastian talking, but he wasn't just talking. He was having a full conversation. It wasn't on the phone or anything like that, but the more George listened, the stranger it became. Sebastian wasn't calling himself Sebastian. He was calling himself Senor Lohan. George froze. It was as if Sebastian believed he was someone else. Then the candle went out and everything went dark again. George squeezed his eyes shut, pretending to be asleep. A long time passed, and then he heard the bathroom door creak open. His stomach turned as the whispers started again, this time right above him. The whispers continued for a while, but George couldn't make out the words. He just lay there, paralyzed with fear. Eventually, Sebastian went back to bed as if nothing had happened. In the morning, he was completely normal again. George didn't have the courage to ask him about it, and when he told me what had happened, I was horrified. My gut told me this wasn't just a case of a child's imagination. Something was wrong. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to tell someone. The first person I called was Maggie. At first, she laughed it off, saying Sebastian had always been a creative kid, but as I pressed her, her tone wavered. Finally, she admitted that his behavioral issues were more serious than she'd let on. A psychiatrist had even suggested he showed signs of multiple personality disorder. They'd moved twice before, and she quietly confessed that Sebastian had been expelled from his previous school. Why on earth hadn't she told me this earlier? How could she put my son in danger like that? She begged me not to notify the school, and I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to respect her request, but another part knew something was very wrong. I muttered an okay and hung up before she could respond. I told myself I'd make a decision by the end of the week, but I never got the chance. That Monday, Sebastian attacked another student during recess. It was serious enough for the school to send out a notice to all parents, though they kept the details vague. By the end of the day, I found out he'd been expelled. I tried calling Maggie, but her phone had been disconnected. The situation was incredibly unsettling. Just days before we'd been talking, and now suddenly she was unreachable. I didn't even know what I wanted to say to her. I just knew I needed to say something. There were no other numbers or emails in the school directory, just that one disconnected number. A few days later, my curiosity became unbearable. I worked up the courage to go to Maggie's house, but when I arrived, it was completely empty. No moving trucks, no signs of a rushed departure. It was just empty. It didn't make sense. How could they have left so quickly? I tried searching for any trace of them online, but found nothing. No forwarding address, no mention of them anywhere. It was as if they'd never existed. This all happened a long time ago, and George wasn't too affected by it. In fact, I think he barely remembers what happened, but I've never forgotten. If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to follow so you don't miss the next ones. Now let's continue. I've been following your work for a while now, and I have to say, I'm a big fan. My wife and I always listen to your stories, especially when we're driving at night. My name is Pedro, and I'm a 24-year-old truck driver from Mozambique, currently working in Chile. You might think I'm a bit young for this profession, but trucking is in my blood. I'm the third generation of drivers in my family. Even though I haven't been on the road for that long, I've already had my fair share of strange encounters. I feel like it's finally time to share some of the inexplicable things I've experienced over the years. Telling these stories, not just to my wife, but also to all of you, helps me get a huge weight off my shoulders. This is my first account. A while back, I worked for a company that specialized in concrete pumping. My job was to transport supplies and equipment for the operation, which meant I was constantly on the road, covering hundreds of kilometers daily. Sometimes I had to make stops in multiple cities within the same day, making my work shifts incredibly long. I usually started driving at 7 a.m. and wouldn't finish until 9 or 10 p.m. On top of that, I often had to unload the truck myself, dealing with extremely heavy materials. One particular night, I was returning from San Antonio to Viña del Mar, where my company's operations center was located. In theory, the trip shouldn't have taken too long, but the late-night traffic made everything more complicated, dragging out my time behind the wheel. About 40 minutes into the drive, I felt the urgent need to use the restroom. I pulled over in a dark, isolated area. There were no houses or signs of civilization for miles. After relieving myself and doing a quick check of the truck, I got ready to hit the road again. But as I opened the door, my heart nearly stopped. Someone was sitting in the passenger seat. For a moment, my mind went completely blank. I had no idea what to do or say. I always traveled alone, and that night was no exception. Just seconds earlier, I had been standing on the other side of the cab, and the seat was completely empty. I hadn't seen anyone approach, and I certainly didn't hear anyone open the door to get in. The truck's cab was quite high off the ground, so I could only see part of his upper body. It was a man, though I couldn't determine his exact age. He looked much older than me. "Excuse me, sir, but I'm not allowed to take passengers," I told him. I expected him to get out, but he didn't even acknowledge me. He just sat there, staring straight ahead. "It's company policy," I continued. "If it were up to me, I'd help, but I could lose my job for this." I stood there waiting for some kind of response. Nothing. He didn't even glance in my direction. Half an hour passed, no exaggeration. He didn't move an inch. He hadn't said a single word. Finally, I decided to get back into the cab, sitting in the driver's seat, trying to figure out how to handle the situation. I turned on the overhead light to get a better look at him. That's when I felt my stomach drop. The man was massive, easily over 2 meters tall. He was bald with an unsettlingly pale complexion. The night was freezing, yet he was barely dressed and wasn't even wearing shoes. But what disturbed me the most was his appearance. He was unnaturally thin, not just skinny. His skin stretched tightly over his bones as if there was no fat on his body. His face was sunken in with dark, deep eye sockets. His elbows and knees jutted out unnaturally, swollen like they didn't belong to his body. Summoning all my courage, I spoke again. "Are you lost? Do you need me to call someone to pick you up?" Still no response. I asked if he was under the influence of anything, thinking maybe that could explain his condition. Nothing. Then I noticed something horrifying. His chest wasn't moving, he wasn't breathing. 15 more minutes passed. My nerves were on edge. I didn't know how to make him leave, and it was getting late. I needed to reach my destination. So I made a decision. I started the engine and began to drive. I'll be honest, I was expecting the worst. But if he had any intention of attacking me, he would have done so by now. As the truck rumbled forward, I noticed him shift slightly in my peripheral vision. He turned his head towards the window on his side, avoiding eye contact with me. It was as if he was simply waiting to reach a destination, one I knew nothing about. Minutes passed. Then something strange happened. I saw him start trembling. At first it was subtle. Then it became more noticeable, like he was bracing for something to happen. And then, just like that, he was gone. One moment he was there, the next he wasn't. Vanished into thin air. I was so shaken that I almost pulled over, but a deep sense of relief washed over me. I thanked God that whatever had just happened was over. A few days later, I had to take the same route again, but this time during the day. Out of curiosity, I stopped at the exact spot where I had first seen him. I stepped out of the truck and walked around, searching the area. That's when I found it, a cross. It was planted firmly in the ground, marking the spot where someone had lost their life. Families often place crosses along the roadside to honor loved ones who died in accidents. That's when I understood. He hadn't meant to harm me. He had simply been trying to reach his destination, one he never got the chance to reach in life. This wasn't the last strange encounter I had on the road. In fact, it was only the beginning. And those were today's accounts. Like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. I'll bring more stories every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. See you in the next video.